There is a version of you that exists only as a possibility, a fuller, deeper, more authentic self that most people never quite become. Not because the path is secret, but because it is difficult. Carl Jung called the journey toward that self-individuation, and he considered it the central task of human psychological development, a process that is, he said, at once the most natural and the most demanding thing a human being can undertake. The word individuation comes from the Latin individuum, that which cannot be divided. It refers to the process by which a person becomes genuinely individual, not in the sense of becoming eccentric or socially detached, but in the sense of becoming undivided. Whole. A coherent personality in which the conscious and the unconscious, the rational and the irrational, the social mask and the private self, have been brought into meaningful relationship with one another. Jung was explicit that individuation is not the same thing as self-improvement in the ordinary sense. It is not about optimizing your performance, achieving your goals, or becoming more likable. It is not a therapeutic technique or a self-help program. It is something far more radical, a lifelong engagement with the totality of who you are, including, especially, the parts of yourself you would rather ignore. The individuation process typically involves several major psychological tasks. The first is the confrontation with the persona, the social mask we construct to meet the world's expectations. The persona is not pathological. It is a necessary adaptation. But when a person identifies entirely with their persona, when there is no distinction between the role they play and who they actually are, they lose contact with their genuine self. Individuation begins with a crack in the mask, often through a crisis, a loss, or a profound dissatisfaction that the external persona can no longer contain. The next major task is the confrontation with the shadow, the dark side of the personality, the repository of all that has been repressed, denied, and projected outward. This is psychologically demanding work because the shadow is, by definition, what we least want to see in ourselves. But without this confrontation, individuation cannot proceed. The energy locked in the shadow is essential for the wholeness Jung envisioned. For men, the next stage typically involves a reckoning with the anima, the unconscious feminine principle whose integration brings access to the inner life, to feeling, intuition, and creative depth. For women, it involves meeting the animus, the unconscious masculine principle whose integration brings autonomous thought, purposeful action, and the courage to act from one's own center rather than from external approval. These are not stages that unfold neatly and sequentially. They overlap, recurse, and deepen with each cycle of engagement. At the center of the individuation process stands the archetype of the self, not the ego, which is merely the center of consciousness, but the total psyche, conscious and unconscious combined. The self, in Jung's model, functions as a kind of internal compass or organizing center, guiding the individual toward their own completeness. It appears in dreams as figures of authority and wholeness, a luminous circle, a wise elder, a divine child, and its emergence signals that the individuation process is deepening. Jung noticed that individuation tends to accelerate in the second half of life. The first half of life is typically devoted to establishment, building an identity, a career, relationships, a place in the world. These are necessary achievements. But at some point, often around midlife, the strategies that served the first half begin to feel insufficient, even suffocating. The questions that were easy to defer become urgent. What do I actually believe? What have I sacrificed to become who I am? What remains unlived in me? For Jung, these questions were not crises to be managed but invitations to deepen. Individuation does not produce a perfect person. It does not guarantee happiness, success, or social admiration. What it produces is something rarer and more durable, a person who is genuinely themselves, capable of suffering and joy without being destroyed by either, related to others without losing their center, grounded in their own experience rather than borrowed identities. Jung describes such a person as having achieved a kind of inner authority, not the authority of social status, but the authority of having truly met themselves. The path is never fully complete. The unconscious is always larger than consciousness, and there is always more to integrate, more to discover, more to become. But the direction matters more than the destination. Each step toward wholeness, each honest engagement with what has been ignored or denied, moves the person closer to the unique configuration of being that was always, in some sense, their own. Subscribe to Psychology Theories Explained to explore more of the ideas that shape the modern mind.